Hi everyone, this is Aaron for Zollotech. We're going to compare the iPad mini to the new Nexus 7. The new Nexus 7 was released a couple weeks ago, and there's a couple different models for each, different price points we're going to talk about, specs, and then I'll give my final thoughts at the end. I've used both continuously since they've come out, and I have a pretty good idea of what both are capable of. The iPad mini comes in slightly more expensive than the Nexus 7 at $329 for 16 gigabytes versus $229 for 16 gigabyte Wi-Fi only models of both versions. You can increase the storage on the Nexus 7 to 32 gigabytes for an additional $30 or $40 at $269.99 and $429 or $529 on the iPad mini for an additional 32 or 64 gigabyte Wi-Fi only. Later on, Nexus 7 will offer cellular connectivity. The iPad mini already offers cellular connectivity and comes in a little bit more expensive at $459, $559, and $659 depending on your 16, 32, or 64 gigabyte storage option. The cellular plus Wi-Fi option for the Nexus 7 will be $349 with 32 gigabytes of storage as the only option. So pretty good deal compared to the iPad mini. The iPad mini, as you can see, is slightly bigger, and that's because the screen is also slightly bigger. And we have a 7.9-inch display on the iPad mini, where we have a 7.02-inch display on the Nexus 7. However, the Nexus 7 has a much higher resolution and pixel density on the display itself. The iPad mini has a pretty low resolution for what it is, 1024 by 768 pixel resolution with 163 pixels per inch. The Nexus 7 pretty much doubles that and then some at 1920 by 1200 pixels with a 323 pixel per inch display. So it's basically what Apple would call a Retina display in a very small package. The displays on both look great. They're both IPS technology. However, the Nexus 7 looks phenomenal and far better than the iPad mini when it comes to text, and I can show you some of that later when we go to some website testing. As far as what's inside of both of these, the iPad mini has a slower 1 GHz dual-core A5 chipset with 512 megabytes of RAM, while the Nexus 7 comes in with a 1.5 GHz quad-core Qualcomm Snapdragon S4 Pro processor with 2 gigabytes of RAM. They both have similar Wi-Fi bands A, B, G, and N that are supported, and both have Bluetooth 4.0 technology. And when the cellular version of the Nexus 7 comes out, it will offer GSM HSPA+, 4G LTE connectivity. The only difference is the iPad mini will also work on CDMA networks such as Verizon. Both of them have pretty decent batteries. The iPad mini has a 4400 milliamp hour battery, good for about 10 hours of battery life, and I find that to be true, and that's measured basically playing video. The Nexus 7 has a slightly smaller battery at 3950 milliamp hours, and it's good for about 9 hours of video. I do get slightly less battery life out of the Nexus 7, and it's not too big of a deal. Most people won't notice unless they're using it for the long haul. Now, both of them have different sensors inside, accelerometers, ambient light sensors, gyroscopes, digital compass that allow for things such as screen rotation, and both work equally well when we do that. You can see they both pretty much rotate well. The outside design is really nice. Both of them are about the exact same weight, and both feel really nice in the hand. The nice thing about the Nexus 7 is the back is coated in this rubber coating. Now, I do have a little bit of a skin protector on here that gives that rubbery feel, but the actual back of the iPad mini is aluminum and slightly more slippery unless you put a case on it or something along those lines. You can see, or maybe you can't see, but the iPad mini is slightly thinner as well, although both are extremely thin, and this nice curve on the Nexus 7 really fits the hand quite well. And both are great for reading, but you do get this different book-like feel out of the Nexus 7. They're both great for that, but when it comes to the display, like I mentioned before, the Nexus 7 far exceeds the iPad mini. There are rumors of an upcoming iPad mini with Retina display, but that's not yet out, so in this comparison, we're not going to really be able to tell the difference. Now, both of these devices have forward-facing 1.2 megapixel cameras. They record in 720p video. If we look at the back of the devices, both have 5 megapixel cameras that record in 1080p as far as video goes. The difference between the Nexus 7 in the back, though, is we have an NFC sensor or tag that allows us to make changes based on little near-field communication tags that we can set up to do tasks. And we also have wireless charging built in, so if you have a Qi charger, or you also may see it as QI, but it's pronounced Qi, it will allow you to wirelessly charge the Nexus 7. So that's also a nice little benefit. The layout of both devices is pretty similar. You can see we have a power sleep-wake button on the Nexus 7 here, followed by our volume buttons, and there's also a microphone right here. On the iPad mini in the same spot, we have volume button up and down, and then we have a rotate switch or a silent switch depending on how you set the settings. The sleep-wake button on the iPad mini is on the top, and on the top of the Nexus 7 you'll find a 3.5mm headphone jack along with some speakers, and you'll have speakers on both ends of the Nexus 7 giving it a stereo sound at all times, which is really quite good and much better than the iPad mini. On the iPad mini you do have two speakers, and they're around the center of the lightning connector, and you have speakers here and they sound good, but when you're holding it sideways or in landscape mode you don't get a stereo effect from side to side. So the Nexus 7 definitely does a nice job there. On the bottom of the Nexus 7 we have a micro USB connector as well. When it comes to touch sensitivity, both respond quite well. We really don't have any issues there. Both feel great, and I would say they're equal as far as that goes, which is saying something for Android, as it was a little bit lacking as far as that in some devices. They've done a great job, though, with the Nexus 7. We have the different drop-down menus on the Nexus 7, and we have our little notification center on the iPad, but that's differences between the Android and iOS. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I will say that iOS is really refined and works well, but we're going to see a major revamp with iOS 7, and the Android 4.3 that comes on the Nexus 7 is really great as well. It's very slick, very fast, and very responsive. It works really well, and I'll show a couple comparisons here in a moment. Both tablets are really a joy to use, great to read books on, but the Nexus 7 really wins when it comes to that. The text is just super crisp and super clear. To give you an idea of speed of application loading and web browsing, let's open the browsers. Here we have Chrome, here we have Safari. And now the keyboard on the Nexus 7 has swipe built in. Some people love it, some don't. I find I use it more and more now that I'm using this more often. But we'll go to the keyboard and we'll type out zollotech.com. And then on this one, instead of typing, I can just kind of swipe here. And I've got zollotech and .com, and then we'll hit go. So you can see both will load. It goes back and forth depending on how I'm loading this. If Zollotech's cached over here, it loads really fast. Both scroll well, but you can see the Nexus 7 occasionally lags for some reason. That's just something to do with Android. I see that more and more, and I'm not sure why it still hasn't been ironed out. But that's one thing that it needs improvement. Now, you may or may not be able to see this, but the text on the Nexus 7 is just super crisp and looks like you're looking at paper, where the iPad text is good, but it's still a little pixely. It's just not as crisp, not as clear as the Nexus 7, and that's due to its lower resolution. However, both work nicely. It's just a much nicer experience to read, especially if you can see those fine pixels. We'll go back home. And what we'll do is we'll actually load Pulse, which I have synced. They're both logged into my account, so let's open Pulse on both. And you can see they're both loading. I have some different websites, and they both load about the same depending on what we're looking at. But you can see now on the Nexus 7 it appears to scroll a little bit more smoothly, and it was a little jaggy on the iPad. Now if we go back, let's take a look at an application such as a game. I've loaded Angry Birds Space on both of these devices, and I thought I'd show you what that looks like as far as how quickly they load. If I go to our little application drawer here on Android, we can go to Angry Birds Space. So let's open those right now. You can see how quickly it loaded, or at least to the splash screen on the Nexus 7. And we're to the main screen. You can see it's still loading on the iPad mini. So the Nexus 7 is extremely fast. So you can see they're both extremely fast. Let me change this back here. and both really nice. Now, one of the things that we do benefit from, I think, a little bit on the iPad less than we do on the Nexus 7 is the multitasking or task drawer. If you double tap the home button, you can tap and hold and close each application. On the Nexus 7, it's a little bit different. We tap this and just swipe it off the screen, and it closes it. Now, that changes a little bit in iOS 7, so that may or may not be a fair comparison. They're both similar that way, but as of right now, it's better on Android. When it comes to cameras, neither are fantastic, but the iPad mini is definitely a little bit better in that it uses the iPhone 4's 5-megapixel camera. It really does a nice job of taking images. I don't really recommend taking images regularly with your iPad anyway, but it does a better job overall in general situations than the Nexus 7. Now, finally, I thought I'd give you my final thoughts on both devices. I've used both for quite some time. I basically like iOS and Android at this point exactly the same. If I have to pick one of these to play games on, I'm probably going to pick the iPad mini just because the selection is a little bit greater, and I know a lot of people say they're not free games all over the place, but that's not necessarily true. I'd say there's just as many free games as there is on Android. It's more the type of games or the refinement of the games. As far as reading a book or reading text or web pages or even playing video, I highly prefer the Nexus 7 in that it's really fast and it also has a really crisp screen. You really just can't get past that when you compare the two devices. It's such a dramatic difference, and the price difference is much less on the Nexus 7. So my recommendation would really be based on if you already are within the Apple or Android ecosystem. If you are already using Apple products, you've got a lot of Apple apps on an iPad, I would probably buy the iPad mini or wait for the Retina version of it. If you've already got Android, I would say just the same for the Nexus 7. Go for the Nexus 7. You're not going to lose out unless you've got some specific things you want to use the iPad for. You also have the benefit of better speakers on the Nexus 7. You have a GPS built in, even if you have the Wi-Fi version. And overall, it's just a really fast device. You will get a little bit better battery life out of the iPad, but it's really whatever device you want to use. As far as build quality goes, the iPad mini's built a little bit nicer. It feels made out of a little bit more premium materials, but you do get that rubber back on the back of the Nexus 7 that gives it a nice little grippy feel and seems to do a great job. It's really hard to recommend the iPad over the Nexus 7 at this point, and I would personally wait until the Retina version of the iPad comes out and then check out the comparison again. If you have any questions or comments or anything else you want to see regarding these two different devices, please let me know in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. As always, thanks for watching. This is Aaron. I'll see you next time.